friends. Welcome to another weekly episode of the Co-Living Coach Show. I am your host, Christine McDaniel, and CEO of Kndrd, which is software for the co-living industry. And you guys, first, let me remind everybody, please get your tickets to the Co-Living Hub Conference in Los Angeles, April 25th and 26th. They found a beautiful venue in Santa Monica right by the beach. However, the occupancy limit is smaller than we were planning. This is for co-living operators from around the world to attend. If you are in the co-living industry but not an actual operator, we do still have sponsorship opportunities available. And we have some amazing corporate partners coming in. It's going to be an incredible event, especially those that went to Spain last year. You guys already know this. So I definitely wanted to talk about that first. But today, let's launch into today's episode. So I have to admit, this is the most fun I've had talking to lawyers in a long time. Well, other than my own lawyer, shout out to Curtis in Los Angeles. So today we actually bring on two attorneys based out of New York, and they know co-living and expanding internationally like nobody else. And it was such an amazing conversation. It was so good. We went an hour and a half. And guys, I know that's long for a podcast for a show. However, this is free legal advice for those that are especially just starting out, or especially the larger operators looking to expand abroad into other countries. So let me read both of their bios, talk about the firm they work for, and then we will launch right into this very fun episode. They're both with Osborn Clark, which is a full-service international law firm with offices in 27 locations. Osborn Clark does not practice U.S. law, but rather offers access to highly experienced European and Asian lawyers who can pragmatically advise on how to expand into and succeed in a global market. Jonathan Mills is an associate director in the real estate department at the firm. He advises on a variety of property-related matters, focusing on the alternative residential market, including co-living, student accommodations, build to rent, and multifamily and assisted living care. And he is currently working out of the New York office, where he's advising U.S. companies on English legal matters and supporting their global legal projects. Jonathan is working closely with Osborn Clark's international offices and network of law firms around the world with their cross-border real estate and infrastructure projects. And specific to co-living, Jonathan advises companies in relation to international expansion, but also their English real estate requirements. Together with his planning, finance, corporate, employment, IP, and tech, commercial and litigation colleagues, Jonathan offers his co-living clients a managed service across all legal disciplines. And he is originally from the UK, so we had to talk about Brexit. We will mention that too. Also on with him is Tim Rezendes, and he is American. So we've got a power team here. We're covering two continents. And he provides support and guidance for the firm's US clients as they extend their reach overseas, working with a wide network of in-country experts across the globe to ensure a seamless service. He advises fast-growing companies from a number of sectors on both their initial market entry and across a broad range of cross-border issues as they continue to grow overseas. Tim has been working with U.S. companies expanding globally for over 10 years. He also previously led Osborn Clark's business development efforts in the firm's Silicon Valley office prior to him moving to New York in 2016 to launch their East Coast office. And he plays a key role in the firm's international expansion team, business development strategy, and is an active member of New York's transatlantic community. So again, you guys, I know you're thinking this is going to be a dry episode because it's lawyers, but actually they are super cool. And I was really excited to bring you guys in on the conversation. Actually, I love their positive outlook and their passion for expanding the real estate sector of co-living quickly and in the right way. Because as entrepreneurs, sometimes we tell the law is the last thing on our mind. These guys know their stuff. We had a great conversation, so enjoy. Hello, everybody. Christine here with our next guest this week. We have, on the left, we have Tim, and on the right, we have Jonathan. They're both with Osborn Clark. And we're bringing on some lawyers today, you guys. Why are we doing this? Because they specialize in international expansion for the co-living industry. They're already working with some pretty big brands, and especially those going into Europe and Asia. Any US-based companies? I know there's some US-based companies expanding over there. I know there's some expansion coming over here. Very exciting times for co-living. So definitely wanted to thank you guys both for coming on this week.
Good to be here. No, thanks so much for having us.
Of course, of course. So let's start with you, Tim. Let's talk about your background real quick and kind of how you got involved in this sector.
Sure. So I'm a US lawyer by background, and I spent about a dozen years starting off in Silicon Valley working with fast growth companies, typically in the tech space, most of which had raised venture capital funding. And at any stage of the growth cycle, international markets would start to be more interesting. And so I've been advising these companies on that international growth trajectory for a dozen years now. Currently based in New York, and since I've been here the last few years, we've seen a lot of companies in the prop tech, co-living space become very international very quickly and extend their model into foreign markets. And so we've started to do a lot of the typical international expansion work within this space.
Awesome. And I know you guys are like a power team. So Jonathan, I would love to hear your background.
So my accent gives me away.
Yes.
I'm a real estate lawyer from London. And so I advise on property matters, focusing on what we call alternative residential markets, which includes co-living, student accommodation, build to rent or multifamily as it's called here in the US, and assisted living and care. So specific to co-living, I advise in relation to, or with Tim, in relation to international expansion, but then also once a business opens in a new jurisdiction, issues like planning, and with my other colleagues, finance, corporate issues, employment, IT, tech, litigation if needed. So sort of a full spectrum for our co-living clients. I'm currently here in New York with Tim and his team. And what we do out of this office is, as Tim said, help clients expand their business to new jurisdictions. And I'm sort of leading on the real estate and the co-living side of that.
And as a firm in the US, Osborn Clark's been here for about 20 years doing this work, primarily for US companies as they go into the UK, European markets, and then increasingly into Asian markets on that growth trajectory overseas. And we help in that entire life cycle, from putting the first person on the ground in a foreign country to scaling the business and the entire model into new regions globally.
Awesome. And then, but you guys don't, so I know you have 27 offices around the world. And again, you guys are in New York right now, but you guys don't practice US law, but you still consult with US based companies, correct?
Absolutely. So I have the distinct pleasure to be the only American lawyer at Osborn Clark out of about 1,200. So our view is to be close to our clients in the US market. So we're in the time zone and adept at working with them here, but then working with our experts globally that can give the very specific advice and input in each market. Because as we know, real estate gets very local very quickly. So we have both the in-time zone presence here where we are in New York and a team on the West Coast, and then we have our experts in all the key markets overseas.
Good. Oh, good. Okay. So I'm glad you guys elaborated on that. And then I know you guys have NDAs with your clients, obviously, so you can't say names, but like, what are the size of the co-living, companies that you guys are currently working with to do these international expansions? Like unit size, I guess, or bed count.
So, generally what we find, and to answer your question at a high level first, for companies generally that we work with, we'll tend to work with sort of fast growing companies with expansion on their mind. And so that tends to come when they are a couple of rounds into their fundraising maybe, and sort of they've built a strong presence and strong brand in their home jurisdiction, and then are looking at how their product transfers cross-border and into other jurisdictions. Whereas, as you know, with co-living, the model transfers very well because of the underlying issues that it seeks to address. So it seeks to address issues with housing stock, and then sort of broader issues such as wellness, sustainability, things like this. So things that are not tied by any one boundary or border. And so they're the companies that we tend to be working with. So in terms of our co-living clients here in the US, with quite a few, they're varying in size, and it's anything from sort of operators that have just gone through their Series B round of funding. And bed size will vary. It varies from the hundreds to the thousands. In the US, we work with a full spectrum of clients, and it's more on, concern is the wrong word, but we're we think the time is right to talk to them when they've sufficiently built up their presence in the US. They know their business inside out, so they can they're really battle hardened and ready for all the nuances and market differences when they go abroad, which in co-living there are a lot. The overarching model will work very similarly in each location, but there are so many minute factors that go into not only a decision as to what countries or cities to open up in, but also where will best work, so they can best deliver consistency of product and brand in different locations.
I think it's an interesting space. So for a traditional tech company, I primarily see a company that's just touching the technology, not necessarily the real estate, looking internationally around a round of funding. So the initial larger cash infusion, growing the US presence, and then going overseas. In this space, I was speaking with a company yesterday who already has a Portugal and a UK operation. They're a tech platform for vacation rentals and things like that. So more of a tech layer applied to real estate, and they're already overseas very quickly. And then specifically within co-living, even on the real estate side, I think operators are looking at what are the key cities and markets. And depending on where you start, you might go to cities that are closer to you or more akin to the community type that you're already serving, but that could be in a foreign country very easily. And so we are seeing these companies go into foreign markets more quickly than even a traditional tech company, where ostensibly it's much easier to just go and put a sales team on the ground or hire some engineers overseas, but to actually go and to operate and have assets overseas too.
No, and that's a great point. And, again, with Kndrd, we fought tooth and nail because we're global, but we're starting with specifically North America and the European continents because, versus every single country around the world. And because it's software. So for me, and co-living is such a global play. So it's like, why would we not do? That's way easier for a technology company to do versus like a brick and mortar. Okay, we're leasing actual physical assets in a completely different country with different different regulation, different rules. Is there a city that you guys that you think that you've seen some really successful quick expansion happening?
So I'll answer it first from just the pure technology side. So we see a number of European companies coming into the US market. So a lot of our clients that we advise in Europe come into the US market. Many times those might go through New York just because it's a lot closer coming from the European side, or others going out to the Silicon Valley market because it's obviously the hotbed of tech in the US. But the traditional example has been a company starting in the US and growing in the US as one market. Typically Europe is then the next key market. Traditionally, that's gone through the UK for a number of reasons, being business friendly, same language, all the kind of soft factors and familiarity that makes it a good operating base from which to go into Europe as a market. We'll come on to Brexit, I'm sure.
Yes.
We'll have to discuss at some point.
I already warned you guys. We're going to talk about it.
But that model does shift a bit depending on, if Brexit impacts the business, or there are other places in Europe that are becoming kind of hotbeds for fast-growing companies going into the European market as well.
Yeah, and I guess co-living specific, there are certain cities going for a US operator moving into Europe, or the UK and Europe as we have to say now. There are several cities that are particularly hot at the moment. So London is incredibly popular, as Tim said. From a business perspective, if it's still being managed from the US, very close time zone, as is much of Europe, language not a barrier, and also sort of acceptability of the model and the structure is becoming more and more popular in that market, and more available and accepted. Whereas the big European cities that we tend to see, Amsterdam, very popular, Berlin, incredibly popular, and Madrid, Barcelona as well.
Terrific. Yeah. So let's definitely jump into that next. Cause again, I know this episode's going to air in a few weeks, but it was just this past Friday. So not even a week ago announced. So UK left the EU. So you're right. Now we're going to have to get used to saying that, separating them out of Europe. So would love to hear, again, let's start with you, Tim, like your thoughts. I know it just happened, so I'm sure time will tell how it pans out, but what are your guys' initial thoughts?
Sure. So Well, me from a US perspective, working with US companies going into Europe as a market and how to really approach it, there haven't been significant changes. So from a legal perspective, there's a transition period going on right now through the end of 2020. As we go into 2021, we'll know what that future relationship looks like between the UK and Europe. In the immediate term, since Brexit's been an ongoing saga for a number of years, there's a few areas that impact. Regulation will change. There's certain companies that have made quick moves out of the UK because they need to be within the EU going forward. We've seen some movement there. What we're seeing, especially for fast-growing companies or those in the co-living space, it's going to be really people and talent that has been impacted most directly, because when the UK is within the European Union, it's very easy to go into the UK market, to go into London and be able to recruit talent from across Europe. Once the UK is fully out of the European Union, then there'll be a process in order to bring Europeans into the UK. And of course, for Brits going into Europe, if you're going into, let's say, Amsterdam as a market and you want to bring talent over, there's just more considerations to make. It's still approachable to get the talent you need in these cities. There's just going to be more of a process once we get through the end of this year and know what that relationship is going to look like. I would say that, and then some of the regulatory impacts that we've seen, largely in other industries. If we're talking about co-living or tech generally, it hasn't had as much of an impact that I've seen. And for a British perspective, here's Jonathan, thanks.
Power team.
Yeah, indeed. So, as Tim said, employment and people is going to be a big one. So, as Tim said, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, which obviously doesn't help business and doesn't help our clients when they're expanding their business. Nobody likes uncertainty, which has been a lot of people's big issue with the Brexit process today. Employment is a big one. At the moment, there's free movement of people and workers have certain rights. And so the general advice around the market is that people should be moving quickly on hiring employees if they're looking to, because it's a very favourable EU landscape at the moment. So free movement and protections for employees are very good at the moment. And so a lot of co-living companies, particularly with the brand and the culture that they look to instill and diversify amongst their expanding business, then those are things that we're recommending that people sort of really focus on. And I guess the other big things for me are tax, the uncertainties around tax and duties and things like that. And so as soon as that becomes clear, we'll be advising our clients, because obviously the big things for expanding business are operational factors and cost factors. And so tax is an unknown at the moment, and we don't know how certain businesses or certain transactions are going to be treated. And data is going to be another big one. I think so. Personal data, co-living companies will hold a lot of personal data. And so Tim and I will be, as soon as the position is clear, Tim and I will be advising a lot of clients on how to best be compliant with their management of data as well.
It's probably worth saying on that point that the data is a big component of this in all aspects of the stack within co-living. And there are certain regulations in Europe. People might have heard of GDPR being the large regulation across the European landscape. In a Brexit context, the broad brushstrokes of GDPR will still apply within the UK. So if you're operating in London, there's still a compliance piece there. And then companies are probably aware that states like California have a new regulation that just came out. And so both from a domestic US standpoint, how you collect, treat, process, and transfer any personal data is becoming very key to the way you operate. There's policies and things you can do from a legal perspective. There's the technology side to how you're collecting that and utilizing that data as well. And so generally, this is a key consideration for all stages of a business, to have this built-in privacy by design within the way that your data flows are designed, whether it's in the US or into a European market.
No, Tim, and I'm so glad you covered that. You know, literally this weekend I watched, the Cambridge Analytica documentary, The Great Hack. And it's just like, again, how do we get in front? And, we were in Europe, with our tech company last year, and GDPR is like a big deal. And that was important to us. So we that was like our baseline. So when California just, January 1st, implemented that, it's like, okay, great. We were already at that, we're already at that standard. You know, the client, you know, it's their data. We're just accessing the data, right? It's like who owns the data and all of that. So actually I'm glad to see they're tightening up, to be honest. Even owning a technology company, it's like this stuff is super important. And so you guys are advising your clients, do you guys do the same thing where it's like, hey, let's from the start, you know, kind of have this baseline?
Absolutely. That's the ideal. That as you're developing your product, as I know you're developing different products for the business, thinking about the data you're collecting, what you're doing with it in terms of processing, any sharing of that data, any cross-border data transfers you're thinking about doing, especially between Europe and the US market. It's really key. You saw it firsthand in Amsterdam and across Europe. I think what we're starting to see then is companies that are impacted by this in the US are thinking about this much earlier on in the process, which is great, because the issue used to be is you would build your company in California and then look to broaden that out into Europe. And all of a sudden you're coming across GDPR and all these regulations for the very first time and thinking, okay, how do I adjust my business now to actually be able to operate into a different jurisdiction with these strict regulations?
No, that's so helpful. No, and my co-founder's German. He's from Hamburg. So he's like, he knew, you know, he's the CTO and he built the platform based on GDPR. And I get over there and I'm like, what does GDPR stand for? You know, like in the beginning. And, you know, and again, it was, you're exactly right. You know, for those that didn't know, then if we didn't know that in the very beginning, it would have been a lot harder.
You were probably way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, we were for sure. Yeah,
it's super. It's something that Tim and I drive home to a lot of our clients who are expanding. Is you have to know and you have to diligence the market that you're going into, and this is a prime example of that, because it's almost the way we explain it to some clients is a data culture, and so the US has always had a slightly different take on privacy to Europe. And so it's understanding how your clients will, and your customers as well, will understand the use or like their data to be used and protected in other countries. And that sort of transcends expansion and co-living as well. And when I say that, what I mean is that it comes back to my market point, is you have to understand the market you're going into to be able to properly deliver your product and keep your brand, keep your brand strong and transparent in the way that you built it up in your home territory.
No, Annie, you guys, again, thank you. I'm so glad we're getting a little deep on the tech combo, because I know a lot of these large operators that listen to the show are building in-house, which is totally fine. You know, so they're thinking like, okay, what do we need to do when we're building this tech platform, when we go cross-border, when we're expanding internationally? So I appreciate that. Is there anything else on the technology front, again, with these larger operators? Any things to consider, advice, you know, whether, you know, of course, we'd love for them to be on Kndrd if they need to be, but if they're building their own, what else do they need to know?
Yeah, so just a couple of things to point out there, especially if we're talking about the cross-border aspects of this. So we talked about data, being aware of the regulation, but also, as Jonathan said, the culture around the collection of data, how people expect to have that data handled in working with people, whether it's on the payment, the tech platform, just the general kind of onboarding of personal data. If somebody's signing up for a new co-living space, whatever that model looks like. Things like IP are very important. We talked briefly about a brand, but ensuring that the brand is protected outside whatever the home market is. That's something you can do at the very beginning. You know, there's many examples of either companies that haven't trademarked that brand into international markets. They eventually expand and find out that other people have already secured rights to that. So thinking about that brand, protecting that brand from the very beginning. IP generally, so if there's any sort of IP that's protectable that you're developing either in-house or integrating in, worth considering that from an IP protection perspective. Those are the key technology points from a corporate. One thing to think about though is once you get into the cross-border aspects, the way in which you're actually contracting with customers, with your users, depending if it's more B2B or B2C play within that, is going to need to change, and taking into account local laws in all contracts, whether it's consumer protection laws, which are very different in most European markets than they are in the US. In B2B contracts and relationships, thinking about what happens if things don't go right, and where any disputes are going to be handled, how you're going to be able to contract with all your suppliers, or if it's B2B software, what does your contract look like in order to help you act more locally as you're selling to foreign customers, which is something to think about as you continue to grow.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd say is to pick up a bit more on Tim's point about brand, and if the business has any particular technology niche or niche that that is particularly unique to a certain co-living business. So, for example, it's really important to make sure you're protecting a certain idea or a certain process that makes your business different to others. Because if that's part of the brand and that's part of what you're selling into new jurisdictions, so a real integral part of carrying on your brand abroad, you need to make sure that's protected.
Perfect. No, that's very helpful. And then for the trademark, however, what if like a brand, like a company name, they file the US trademark for that brand, for that name, how do they do that on a global? Because I already see co-living names that are the same in different countries. And I'm like, what happens if they expand?
Yeah, so it's something you can do at the very beginning. So in your growth cycle, I'm sure as you were thinking about the business, coming up with a name, picking your domain names and so on, that next step should be, okay, how do we protect this name and this brand and this mark that we're building? And so that's making the filings in the US if this is the market you're starting in. And you can start to do that on a more global basis. So it's you can do that from the very beginning. And we would recommend getting started earlier rather than later. Not so much of a copycat issue, but really that there's only so many names out there, and there's only so many co's and things ending in tech and things like that as we think about this. So protecting that, and you can do it on a more regional basis, and it's following those processes to make the applications and do the filings with, depending where you're going, which a government authority that would be.
Awesome. No, that's helpful. And then so for you guys, and again, I know you're co-living, you're in student accommodation, you're in, assisted living. So let's just say like shared housing in general, like what excites you guys the most about what you've seen happening in the last couple of years?
Yeah, so for me, it's, and this is kind of the way that we treat it at Osborn Clark as well. We've invested, as we've seen the market growing, we've invested a lot of time and resource into this area, because one, we see it as really important going forward, but two, it's real estate's a huge part of our business, and it's something that we get really excited about. And it's, for me, it's that really entrepreneurial driven part of real estate at the moment. It's where people are coming up with new ideas, really innovating in the in a space of real estate where people don't tend to innovate very much and haven't for a number of years. So prop tech has become really big and is growing year on year, but but real estate itself hasn't really innovated or tried to innovate for quite some time. It's a very institutionalized business. And for me, co-living is really pushing boundaries and opening people's eyes to different ways of dealing with real estate.
Yeah, so from my perspective, like I think in your background, you got started in the commercial real estate space years and years ago. So I started in law school, and so I'd seen real estate being an industry that hadn't moved as quickly to adopt new models, new technology. It wasn't until we started seeing platforms that allowed for more creative uses of space. Think the Airbnbs of the world years ago, they're able to come up with new ways of utilizing that and taking a tech layer applied to space and then creating new uses for that. And then being able to deploy that very globally, very quickly. And Airbnb is somebody we've watched for a long time and how they've been able to grow and expand in that way. I see co-living doing that, creating different models within the wider space and so many different types of communities that are possible. But it goes very quickly, very, very, very early in the growth trajectory. And I find that both the users are very international. I mean, tons of expat communities that kind of congregate within a co-living model. We've seen the operator side coming in from Israel, Europe, Asia into the US market. We're seeing some of the US players starting to go into foreign markets, and then the users themselves, so many of them being international that, you know, people that do just 100% international work, it's a very interesting space. Kind of the cutting edge technology side applied to real estate, all within international context, is right in our sweet spot.
Yes, and I love it. It's a $200 trillion global industry that like, no, it's like the last to get disrupted by technology.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is going on? Like, I understand real estate's like cumbersome and there's paperwork, but there's no reason why we can't digitalize that, right? And it is exciting to see, right?
And I guess from our perspective as well, and I touched on it very briefly earlier, it's the coming into new markets for co-living and the expansion of co-living generally. It's the softer side of the market and the things, the issues that it tries to address as well. And not inadvertently, it actively pushes as part of the co-living movement, if you will, things like addressing housing as an issue and limitation of space in key cities worldwide as an issue. Community, so not only community from the perspective of a community of housemates or a community within a building, but also the wellness side of things. So everybody is well documented, the sort of real sort of endemic of loneliness around the world, particularly in the age group and the sort of the generations that largely co-living is aimed at. There's this big loneliness problem, again, something that it tries to address. And then just other real pertinent world issues at the moment that it helps with and is a contributor to the solution. Things like real estate is becoming, and finally, real estate is becoming more and more carbon conscious, more and more sustainable conscious, and sustainability is really, and like I said, it's not addressed in an inadvertent way by this. Co-living companies will very much say that as part of their sell into a new market, instead of building 100 homes spread out or a housing estate of 100 homes, we're looking to home the same amount of people with a tenth of the construction output, and have everybody in one building living together in this community way. And again, it's a nice area to deal with at the moment within the legal profession. As I said, it's very entrepreneurial, and it's something that we really enjoy. We really enjoy working with the founders and the operators of these businesses, who are all super passionate about what they do and are really keen to make change.
Yes, no, and it's so refreshing because you guys, for being lawyers, are so upbeat and positive, and like you could tell, like you love what you do and you love helping, facilitate this movement, and making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Because as entrepreneurs and as founders, we're moving fast. So we appreciate like you guys just understanding this space so well. And that's what was so great was, Jonathan reached out, you reached out on LinkedIn, and we're trying to unite this insanely fragmented, not just industry, but all these players in co-living, the real estate developers, the property investors, the operators, the brands. And, so that's why we're doing this directory. And, Jonathan's like, hey, can we be listed? We're helping on the law side of things for co-living. So really, really glad you guys are on this week. And again, I think some of our best episodes are usually the ones where we bring in, the educators or the real estate developers, the investors, not just have operators on. Because then again, we're getting I love seeing these other aspects of this industry. So thank you for that. So my next question is from a branding, okay, so taking this company from a branding and a culture standpoint on this brand, it's brick and mortar, they're expanding cross-border, like what are some other pieces of advice when it comes to the brand and the culture and keeping that consistent?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, it's the great thing is it's all achievable. It's just an extension of your existing business and your team and your culture and how to extend that out. As we know, these markets are very localized. So there's always an aspect of how do you fit the business in. So it's kind of that product market fit issue into each market you go into, and doing your due diligence that the products are right fit, that the user base is right, that the metrics all make sense, at least in your home market, and able to deploy that. But then to have the culture to broaden that out, there's a few ways that companies are able to do that. In my experience, the way to really do it is to make that a key emphasis of any growth initiative of going into any market. Treat it just as you would have at the very beginning, as you were building your company and thinking about, okay, what is my brand all about? What is my mission? Who are the people I want to surround myself with? And how do we make culture really key to what we do? You need to think about that in each site you go into, each jurisdiction, each city, and how you extend that and bring in the right talent. Send over and spend time on the ground with your people to ensure that they are living that brand and able to instill that same type of brand into the business in that market. The culture is always going to be different. The great thing that I've seen so far in co-living is it is very international. The people involved, the users, the whole space is more culturally aware, I think, than most businesses that can be very narrow in thinking about, well, here's my market and here's what we're doing. It's by its very nature, it is much broader, which I think helps it then fit into new markets and places around the world as you're designing intentional communities with a culture and a brand that really means something that represents what you want that community to be about. So personally, I've seen the co-living space be much better at this than other traditional tech spaces or others out there.
Good. Anything to add to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, the interesting thing that Tim and I have found is that we're actually approached to ask how best to preserve brand and to grow brand in new jurisdictions. And what makes our life really easy from that perspective is that a lot of co-living, the founders in particular, or those in the sort of senior management team, really understand that brand and really know what is important to them as a business. And then we advise how that, from a legal perspective, I guess, how that filters into new jurisdictions. So, for example, if you, as a co-living company, flexibility is one of your big MOs in your business and is really important to you as a brand. So either that you allow people to move around like a common would, for example, or you're very flexible on term length. So it's not a rigid 1 year, it's anything from a day to however long you allow people to stay, a number of years, if they would like to. And so that has to come into your legal negotiation as well. So when you're negotiating either your management or your operation agreement, you have to bang the table for those things that are important to your brand. So for a real estate investor or for a regular tenant, they may not be big issues. But if they're key to your business and key to your brand, they have to be really important to the negotiations, and they have to be high on the list of things that you simply won't back down on to make sure you've got consistency of brand as you move and expand your business.
Awesome. And do you guys help? So when they have this list of cities they want to expand into, are you guys like hand-holding and saying, hey, are you guys doing the research on like, okay, well, this city, 30-day minimum occupancy, like you can't do less than 30 days. Do you guys help consult with any of those questions?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we have a certain amount of our own knowledge around that from clients around Europe. As Tim said earlier, we've got 27 offices in Europe and Asia. And so because co-living and alternative residential is so important to us, we have a lot of clients in the space and have our own knowledge and own perspective on a lot of these things. However, what we always look to do as part of the expansion, Tim and I always say to people that we can do the legal bit. It's the value add that we like to bring in as well that really sets us apart. And so we really like to open our network. So the brokers that we know, the advisors that we know, the surveyors that we know, who are all very, it's generally a small community co-living in each city that you go to. Yeah. And so we like to we obviously can't make any promises on things, but we like to make the introductions. We like to open our network up and share our contacts with our new clients to make sure that they can make the best of their move into a new country.
Cool. And generally, I think the industry is more collaborative than many out there. And so trying to find out what the best ways to structure these are to deal with planning issues, whatever it might be, is finding the right way forward for whatever the individual company is in that case, but also from a broader standpoint as to, okay, will this work in this city, in this type of use, in this type of a model? And then obviously that kind of opens it up as others are coming in or seeing what, you know, a peer company is doing within that space. As people are more collaborative, then you can get a better sense as you go in. And then, as Jonathan said, we have a network, and then we have kind of our expert lawyers that know what the deals typically look like and can structure those right so that it works for that model, but in that particular city or city council area or borough, if you're in London, or whatever the, you know, specific requirements are municipally.
No, and it's funny, collaborative is the perfect word. And that's exactly, you know, you're right. These operators are extremely collaborative, even in the same cities. I mean, because they're running 100% occupied with a wait list. So, you know, they'll refer to another community because they know down the road they can, you know, refer back. And I love seeing that these resources are being shared, because I think everybody, and especially all the big operators that I know, you know, they know the bigger everybody gets, the quicker the movement pushes forward. And it, you know, what is it? Rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah,
And
yeah, we're all growing the pie when we're creating these.
for sure, for sure. And, you know, again, like seeing it as like a legit asset class, it was almost there. Do you guys see it in the forefront? I thought 2019 was going to be the year. It came close. It came close. But do you guys see it becoming its own, just like student accommodations is, its own asset class?
So I do, yes. But it, as Tim said, it very much, it's about growing the movement almost. So the more people that expand into different markets, the more operators there are, the more it becomes not only socially, but institutionally renowned, known, accepted. That's when it becomes its own asset class. And the more partnerships you get between developers, landowners, operators of co-living, and the more investment there is in the sector, the more it stands on its own 2 feet.
Yeah, no, perfect answer. Anything to add to that, Tim?
No, I just heard some of the previous episodes in terms of predicting when it's going to become an official asset class. So, I mean, it feels like we're on the cusp. I think a lot of that comes from the financial industry and how they start to classify this. We've had some of the big funds be created now that are starting to deploy capital in this. And then from a real estate community looking at creating this as part of their project, their portfolio, and then what their product mix is going to be, and thinking about it. And I think the student accommodation market in Europe is probably a good example of one where you kind of developed an asset class out of it pretty quickly as that model really took off in those markets. So perhaps this follows that same path.
Yeah, awesome. Just two more things from me, Christine, quickly. Just I was thinking while you were asking that question, the evolution of it's real estate is very much a copycat business as well. And now that the first funds have been set up just for co-living, so DTZ, sort of with the help of the collective, obviously set up the first pure co-living investment fund. And that will roll out in a copycat fashion. Their competitors, we're looking at them, seeing how that performs, seeing how they're doing. They're first to market, so everybody else is playing catch up. And another thing that will help it grow is that the reason we call our practice alternative residential is because there are several strands to something very similar. And so what we've found, and it has been reported as well, it's really well reported in JLL's Future of Living report, and that was that several people are pivoting their model to include, or several operators in slightly different sectors like purpose-built student accommodation or multifamily are pivoting what they do to include or to approach co-living. So for example, schemes when they get to a planning stage are being pivoted from being student accommodation to co-living, not necessarily because they're making a co-living movement, but because co-living told a better story in the location where they were trying to open buildings and things like that. So that cycle of there being a very similar skill set involved, very similar players in the market. So it would take, a developer would not need a different skill set to deliver co-living than it would purpose-built student accommodation. Obviously, there's some design differences and some input differences from the operator as to what they need, but it's a market where there's a lot of similarities across that alternative residential space, and so I think that will help co-living grow as its own asset class as well.
Love that. That's a perfect answer. And I agree 110%. It's exciting to see people even rebrand, like you just said, like kind of like, okay, let's be called co-living because that's what's really taking off. We Live, which is branched off of We Work, they honestly would not come on my show. This was last April. I was trying to get them on. I was talking to their team. And they said, no, Christine, like we don't ever use the word co-living at We Live. We don't want to be in that category. We feel like it's a lack of privacy and, you know, our rents are higher and we don't want to be grouped in with that. You know, it was unfortunate, right? So it's, you know, and I know that one of their buildings, they just sold off. And so they're kind of like shrinking down their portfolio. So that was, you know, a bummer, right? Because I'm like, okay, it's not like co-living isn't like hostels or, you know, they were kind of like comparing it to that. I know it's like, okay, again, this was last April. And, you know, again, I know 2018 was just this banner year. And I think it was, you know, towards the second half of the year, people really started getting it. And even institutional capital, banks, you know, we're singing it from the mountaintops the end of last year. They love the product. They love the returns it's getting. So yeah, that's all good stuff. And speaking of that, you guys, how about this? This is a question I get asked very often. How about these operators and brands? So kind of like, you know, the hotel industry planting their flags and not owning the buildings. Do you guys see one way being better than the other? What are the pros and cons between these operators doing master leases, profit sharing, you know, partnering with the developer or owning the building?
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
So we actually get asked this a lot as well, particularly in the US, where my view is that the institutionalization of the market is further ahead in the US comparative to some European locations, probably excluding London and a few other key cities. But already here, a lot of the large operators have managed to move away from a landlord or a building owner's insistence on a master lease. And so they'll move more into that either operator or property manager model. And it's that whole, as people call it, the hotelization of real estate. So the operator model becoming dominant in delivering some of these asset classes. Obviously, lower liabilities on balance sheet and a different risk profile for operators with that operator management model. But owners and developers then don't get as much security. So going into new territories, it's all about brand and all about covenant strength to be able to dictate the way that you operate real estate. Owning a building or as you said, more likely a master or long lease gives security for the owner, particularly as in a co-living setting, they're likely to require some sort of guarantee, security, or something backing up the obligations from the US parent company, thinking of a US company expanding into Europe. But then, as I said, that then is a hard number on the balance sheet and the operational output and expenditure of a new and growing business. So preference is always going to be for the operator model, I think. But then even thinking through in my head while I'm answering this, there are drawbacks to it, because do you then get less control under that operator model? Or is someone willing to give you the keys to the building almost and say, under that operator agreement, you can go and do everything, which they largely would under a long lease? Are you going to get the same flexibility? I think it will remain to be seen. We've seen it done in different ways. As I said, brand, covenant strength, and also backing is incredibly important. So for some of our co-living clients expanding, they get asked these questions and they get answered who their financial backers are, for example. And if they say, oh, it's X, and X is a US conglomerate worth so many billions and billions of dollars, all of a sudden the conversation changes a bit. They have a bit more gravitas in the discussion, negotiation they're having. But it's a really good question to ask, a really good one for the listeners to understand a bit more about, I think. I don't think either way as a standalone option necessarily works better than the other. I think most growing companies would rather not have the liability on their balance sheet. But as I said, it really depends how each document is drafted, because the key at the end of the day is being able to execute and being able to run the business that you're looking to run from that location in a way that protects culture, protects brand, and allows you to deliver to all of your residents and customers the service and or the excellence of service and the excellence of experience that you're looking to deliver as an operator.
Great answer. Okay, so Tim, anything to add to that? That's great, Jonathan. I love how prepared you guys are. You guys are great. This is awesome.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is looking at that as kind of a life cycle question too. And we've seen this, if we think about co-living as being a very wide tent, and you mentioned one example about a We Live that didn't want to be within that tent. And we think about this, there's various different types of models, different communities that are being put together, different layers between the operator side, tech side, developers, designers, and so on. Within all that, though, there's kind of a life cycle to some of these. So there are some we've spoken to that initially were raising capital, but going into the market, trying to find the right real estate assets, dealing with more mom and pop type of ownerships, and needing to have those relationships and a lot of those conversations, education, figuring out what the model would be that would work. And some of those companies that have started off at that part of the market have now gone on to be largely institutional backed, have a lot of funding, and working with more institutional side of the market. So there's different ways to approach the model, but then there's also a life cycle to keep in mind too, of a company that's just starting off with a new approach to this in a different city could start at one end of the spectrum in the way that they structure that deal and the type of landlord they're working with and the operator model, but then also be able to grow off the back of that as they perfect that model, see what they can take and use in a different way as they expand and kind of go maybe upstream in terms of the assets and the other players involved.
I think another point also is market driven. Some European markets insist on or have a strong preference for either as well, either the operating approach or the leasing approach. So one thing we often get asked to do for our clients is analysis on a European basis, or analysis by city that companies are looking to move into, as to what the tolerances are around that, so that then they can make a business decision on the back of that. So is it worth fighting really hard in X jurisdiction, because they're simply going to say no, because culturally and in that institutional owner market, they'll simply say no to it. So we best diverting our efforts in doing something else or negotiating that document in a different way.
Cool. No, and that's great advice from both of you guys, is that, the operator needs to be flexible and nimble. And I most of them already know that, where it's like, okay, it depends on the city you go into, like what's going to be the easier route, knowing you could change it. A lot of the big guys, I know their history of how they started in the very beginning, and then now how they're negotiating these partnerships or licensing agreements, or they're buying some buildings, but not other ones for different reasons. So totally, like, that's extremely helpful when people are making that decision, for sure. So thank you for that advice for everybody listening. And again, I was talking to some, actually this morning, I was excited for this interview, and they were saying, oh, well, why are you doing this podcast and show? And I go, honestly, these are these amazing conversations I get to have anyways with people. And I'm like, gosh, we should like record these and put them out. So, because again, I think people listening appreciate like, oh, okay, this is how I can think of that, or this, or just seeing these different perspectives. So I really appreciate that, you guys. Thanks. Speaking of, another question that gets asked a ton is fractional ownership, meaning could a guest or resident purchase not just a piece of the property that they're living in, a fraction of the property, but maybe a fraction of the actual company, and then access any of the portfolio, live anywhere in the world from that portfolio of their actual locations. So again, from a legal perspective, what are your guys' just initial thoughts? I know people are talking about doing it now. We just haven't seen it executed quite yet. So what are some things to think about or consider?
Just from my perspective, a couple of things I'm seeing, and I do a decent amount of work in the blockchain fintech space, and talking about tokenizing real estate assets and opening that to an entirely different investor class, which could be very interesting in a wider real estate context. It could also work within a co-living model in terms of what in a project-driven type of investment could do it from more of it. That would be, for that example, equity in the company. There are some unique models that are wider dispersed into the US at least around either crowdfunding or Reg A plus offerings and things like that that do open equity up to a larger pool, non-institutional type of investors, but it could be people that like to live in these spaces. They really like that brand and that company, and they want to have a piece of that in terms of being a real part of that community and having an ownership stake in it as well. So I haven't seen any of these in practice, but from what I see, it's the tokenization of the asset on the one hand, and potentially some of the more creative crowdfunding type of models that are now starting to take off. I see largely in the tech space so far, but that could definitely come into this realm as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, and this is a bit of a boring legal response to it, but for me, it's as people have said on your podcast to a similar question before, it's possible and people are open to it. But for me, it's very much about execution and control. And so regardless of your ownership structure, can you deliver a fractional ownership structure in a way that still allows you flexibility to run your business as you need to, and to execute on your business model and make the decisions that you need to move the company in a direction that it needs to go in. And when I say that, it's what abilities, powers, decision-making are you giving fractional owners? If it's simply a silent ownership in the business, then as Tim said, great, because people will feel more invested in the product, feeling more invested in the brand, and you're allowing ownership to the very people that enjoy the product and that are the customers, that are the residents, which is fantastic, and only allows and helps the co-living movement to grow. But if you're then giving devolving any sort of decision-making power down to people, or allowing any sort of group of them to have a veto on how a business is moving, then that's probably not a very productive way to execute a business, particularly in a new jurisdiction.
No, good stuff. No, I love it. And again, yeah, I think we're early. That's why I just purposely keep putting it out to the universe. So hopefully, in 5 years we look back and we could do that with the blockchain, especially, right? I think the technology will get there, and we need more expansion, right? We need brands to expand with more higher bed counts, for them to even want to put this together. So we're a few years out, I'm guessing, but it's all good. We can look back on this.
It's also a way for smaller operators to enter the market as well. Oh, yeah. So if at the same time as occupying their space, they're getting extra investment into the business for a small share, then that can obviously only be seen as a positive, and which is why, as Tim said, a lot of these tech companies consider that crowdfunding or that sort of more innovative way of raising capital.
Yeah, and Star City out of San Francisco, they did a crowdfunding campaign a while back. So I think they were one of the first co-living, brick and mortar companies to do crowdfunding, which is really cool. So again, those people that participated feel like they have some sort of ownership in that brand. So I think we'll probably see more of that, like that people could do right now. There's a couple others that might be launching too, campaigns to crowd fund. So let's see, next question, guys. Without naming any names, do you have any concerns about how some co-living operators are currently operating anywhere in the world? Don't name any brands. I don't want to get in trouble.
I'll just say one thing and leave most of the answer to Jonathan on this, but I think what we talked about the companies in the space and how they're collaborating. I think one of the things I think we had seen previously with tech companies moving very fast into new cities and just going in with their model, hoping it all works. Hopefully regulators don't bat too many eyes or shut them down or come after them, and they just ask for forgiveness instead of permission. I think that used to be a model generally, not to name any names on that side. But years ago, that's how some fast moving companies were going into new markets. What I've seen in co-living that gives me some optimism is it's more of a collaborative process. At the start to finish is working collaboratively with planning officials, with municipalities, starting to kind of fly the flag and say, this is why this model is positive for your city. Here's the problems it solves in terms of housing costs and greater density and sustainability and the community and on and on and on. But to have that conversation, to educate the people at the beginning, to be collaborative in finding how that use fits in with general zoning plans or city planning and all of their considerations. But generally, I find that most people are being more collaborative, which is always our recommendation within this, to be collaborative from the beginning, work with them, because your entire business model can fundamentally get shut down. It could change, or it might just not work if you need to change it very quickly based purely on planning requirements, regulations, and things like that.
No, Tim, real quick before Jonathan answers, I'm so glad you talked about that, because it's one thing to throw scooters in a city and everybody's using them and it's fun, or like car sharing, great. It's kind of like this little added benefit. However, this is living. This is like a roof over someone's head. So if you get shut down, your people could be homeless. That's a lot harder and painful than, a scooter you were using for a couple miles, Yeah,
there's real people involved that are impacted by this. The entire business model in that city and the whole capital expenditure to go into that city is at stake if you don't think about it from the beginning, do the diligence, and be collaborative and working with people to make sure that the regulations and the requirements are met in order to have this model be effective there. You can't just take your scooters and go to a different city. You're literally tied to real estate.
Yep. Perfect answer. Okay, Jonathan, you're up.
Yes, just to add to what Tim was saying there, because that's the main answer to this, I think, is all about collaborating and sort of not dictating or disrupting is going to be the key. Because as Tim said, not only does it affect an individual person, an individual building full with people, possibly due to the demand for co-living at the moment, but it also affects the business model and the asset class as a whole, because the likelihood is one may get shut down on that basis. If there's several shut down, does the city then stop allowing co-living in? Do they stop giving planning permission for co-living buildings? So it really can have a substantial effect. So as Tim said, collaboration is definitely the way to go. One thing I just wanted to add here, I actually had a really interesting conversation on what a co-living company is not doing right at the moment. I was having it with Alex Frankel, the CEO of Vitacon in Brazil. And he said he thinks the industry isn't united enough at the moment, and he thinks there should be some sort of alliance of co-living companies, or at least the larger co-living companies, to make sure that they're getting consistency in certain areas and making sure they've got strength in numbers as a group, which I thought was such a good idea and is so interesting, kind of like a union for co-living companies almost, to make sure that they are, so that people understand what they want to do, how they want to do it, how they're going to be accepted in certain companies, having some clout behind some of the things they're asking for in certain places. So on the planning or the zoning side is to get consistency to allow the local authorities and the local governments of these European cities to understand the product, to understand how they want to deploy it. And as I said, just having more than each company either going in a fragmented fashion and asking for slightly different things, but to bring that consistency together and allow co-living to move forward, not in a sort of a highly regulated or a formulaic way, because each company will want to do things slightly differently, but just to give co-living a bigger voice as it becomes this growing asset class into new cities.
No, let's go a little deep on this, because, okay, so in Los Angeles, I'm talking with them up there about putting a coalition together. We've been talking about it for like a year and a half. a co-living coalition for Los Angeles so we can go to the city and be really kind of collaborative and hands-on in the process of regulation, right? If you're part of that team, then you're kind of ahead of the 8 ball. I'm going to India the end of this month, actually, and same thing in India. They're literally going to the government and they're asking to tax co-living, and they're creating their own coalition. And I know those guys, and I'm excited to see this over there and hear of that. So I'm like, okay, great, guys. Like we want to do the same thing on a city level. You guys are trying to do it on a massive country level. Jonathan, like how would you, on a global level, how would you do that collectively versus city or country or, you know?
So globally, I guess it would work as that strong alliance. The issue might be is that they're going to want to address different problems in each jurisdiction, each major city. And so is it having a global alliance, then they each look at individual cities, or they have a different approach to individual cities? Because having one approach globally probably isn't going to work. It's going to be cumbersome and not going to sufficient detail or ask the right questions in each individual jurisdiction, because it's not one size fits all. And so it's very much going to be looking on an individual or a city by city or country by country basis what to work. But I really do think that having not necessarily one voice, but a bigger voice for co-living operators is going to be an important part of the future.
Or like, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, or what even about like taking the 5, like, you know, I could think of the brands off the top of my head, these 5 fast growing, very large brands that are already expanding globally. What if they, you know, there's 5 key team members that create, you know, that banded together to try to unite, to try to talk to these different government agencies in these different countries and different cities. Again, I don't know if the hotel industry did something similar. You know, I know Coliving Hub, which I'm on the board of, which is a nonprofit organization, but we're more for education of the actual operators. We're not going to the different, you know, regulators.
So a good example I've seen, I was trying to remember it as we were talking there. It's called the Sharing Economy UK. So this was a London-based initiative. I was at the launch in 2015, I think. And it's a collaborative between industry, government, advisors like us. So Osborn Clark was a member. You know, Airbnb is one. Some of the bigger U.S. brands, Zipcar, TaskRabbit, people like that. Turo on the automobile side. So thinking about the shared economy, in this case applied to space, and bringing together a collaborative group, largely of people within the industry, but really with a focus on the regulators and the policymakers, the UK central government, and then within the mayor of London and specifically to the local governments as well. And so that was kind of an advocacy, education type of an initiative. It's gone through different iterations, but you know, it's been a way in which it paved the way, and I think at least gave kind of a collective voice to a lot of people in adjacent aspects of this industry as they were trying to have a collective voice to the government and be able to push for similar types of policy initiatives that would then pave the way for everybody collectively to be able to operate, have their business model, for the government to understand what it was all about, how it benefited them, and then also what changes might need to be made in order from a policy standpoint to enable that.
It was in 2015? When did they start?
So.
And
I think so.
Yeah, in the UK, what was it called?
Sharing Economy UK.
Okay.
It's
yeah, okay.
SEUK for short.
Okay, I love that. Okay, so that's a great example, perfect example. Okay, everybody listening. Again, we're it's such a new industry that it's a little premature, but we need to think about this stuff now, because the quicker we start, you know, talking to the policymakers and trying to really make, and again, I think it's moving fast in the right direction, which is great news. San Diego opened up just recently, kind of opened the doors a little bit more to be more friendly to co-living concepts and the ideas that they're building here. So
just consistency that sort of allows red tape and bureaucracy to disappear a bit quicker. So one of the issues that co-living companies and operators are happening in London is that everybody has taken, or the large players in the market have all taken a different approach to planning and zoning, which is at the moment people are getting their permissions, but at the moment it's a very fragmented aspect of market entry at the moment. So people are either going in as residential, getting their own permission, which in the UK is called sui generis, so a specific, doesn't fit within any of the traditional use classes, and you're given a specific permission for your use only. Some are going in on the hospitality zoning. And it will start to cause certain operators difficulty when they go into a market or into a region in London where somebody has done something different to the way they would usually do it, which will then lead to the company having to take legal advice as to how they need to do it, reorganizing their internal policies and governance around how they apply for planning or zoning. And so consistency of approach will facilitate faster growth of co-living in certain cities.
No, you're right. And some of them are, they're zoning as a hotel, and then they're paying crazy taxes just to kind of push through and get the night and be able to do a nightly stay option versus 30-day minimum. So yeah, I think you're right. It's like, how do they unite in the very beginning and have a good way of doing it moving forward? That's consistent. Perfect. And then, so let's see here. Another question I had is, what are some of your guys' favorite co-living brands currently, anywhere in the world, and what do you like most about what they're doing? Like, if each of you want to pick one.
Okay, go for it. I really like what Common are doing at the moment. And so it will sound like a really obvious answer because they're such a large brand now here in the US, but it's the way that they are pivoting their initial offering to make sure that their product works in different states, for example. So they've really had to look carefully at what they do to have entry into the New York market, so Manhattan, and so they became more of an affordable operator almost in Manhattan. So they partnered with other corporations to be delivering an element of affordable housing to the boroughs of Manhattan. Whereas obviously traditionally they're very much a large co-living operator, but they've also done some other really interesting products like co-living, but almost co-living aimed at key workers in certain cities. And so again, looking at a slightly different housing issue in society, so how we home hard-working key workers, and they've looked to solve that problem as well. So I really like them because of the way that they've pivoted their model but kept their strong brand, so they can diversify into different states and different areas of the US.
Got it. Cool. And then Tim, what's your answer?
Yeah, I think I would point to that I know is a favorite. Sure. I think what I would point to that I think is a favorite of yours too would be Zoku in Amsterdam, because one, I studied there and it's one of my favorite cities, but the model is different too in terms of I think about it from a corporate hospitality standpoint. So we're an international law firm. We send people around the world to go work in our offices. Jonathan, for instance, being in London. I've worked in London coming from the US, and we send people globally all the time. And the options from a corporate housing standpoint are very traditional, serviced, zero community whatsoever, very bland. They're expensive for what you get, and they're frankly not even as flexible as you would like in most cases. That's the corporate housing model that we see on the one hand. The other end is having somebody like Jonathan thrown to the wolves to try to find something on, I don't know, a platform out there to find a place to live for short term that's flexible, furnished, has kind of everything ready to go. Co-living generally is great for that model. And then I see somebody like Zoku that really fills that gap to be something that could be for somebody that's over for a few months or two from a corporate standpoint that can be sponsored by their company, but also have a workspace, a living space, a community, And it could be something that could be longer term, but also could be a much shorter stay for a business trip for a couple weeks into the market. So you kind of can run your business from a different place like that, or somebody like us where we have a great team in Amsterdam at Osborn Clark, but I might want to go work in our Dutch office for a while. I could go and easily slot into that for my short-term living situation that I think solves a real problem in the market. Maybe it's just personal to us because we are sending people all over the place all the time, but there are many, many large corporates out there that send people globally. It's challenging with visas right now in some cases, but it's a big part of the way that big corporations are putting their headcount in the right places around the world. And frankly, I think there's a huge gap in the market that somebody like Zoku is filling with that right now.
Yeah.
Tim, I didn't know you lived in Amsterdam. That's awesome.
Yeah, long time ago.
Cool. It's an amazing, yeah, it's one of my
Great
favorite
to
cities. Yeah.
Just, Tim sort of triggered two more in my head there, if I may. And one.
Okay, I'm keeping score. We have a scoreboard. So which two are they?
Sorry. So one sort of is a bit personal to me, but the first one is what Ollie are doing in New York as well. So Tim's point on Zoku, they're sort of diversifying the model and offering something a bit different. So the things that Ollie are doing that I really like, because some people are still a bit nervous about co-living and whether they want to co-live, and they've got that, their app is great and they've got that bed vetter service, so you can sort of work out a bit better who your roommates are going to be. So I think that's a really cool twist on it. And I actually went to a panel where Ollie was speaking, and it didn't go down that well with some of their other co-living cohorts, but they sort of said the way that we've looked at it from an institutional point of view is that we're able to put back what we do, and they don't do any structural work in buildings, for example, if they retrofit them. So everything can go back to how it was, and that's their twist on, not that if co-living doesn't work, but if it doesn't become as big an asset class as everyone wants it to be and doesn't have that strength of position in the market, they can still sell themselves into big landlords and say, what's the downside of having us in? If we can increase your NOI by 20, 30%, plus if suddenly this whole thing disappears, you get your building back just as it was, where's the downside? So I thought that was a really nice twist on what they're doing. And the one that is quite close to home for me, and it's not necessarily co-living, but a branch of, is the brand Kin Families. And so I sort of moved over to New York 6 months ago, my wife and 2-year-old son, and we really struggled to find somewhere that we wanted to live. So lots of great places in New York, but not many that are for us, whereas Kin have now bought a model out where it's almost multifamily / co-living, but for families. So you get all the services on an app that you could need as a young family. There are loads of other families in the building to build relationships and make friends with, whereas sort of in traditional multifamily, particularly in New York, people on maternity leave go back very quickly. Everybody's working long hours. So my wife, for example, who looks after our son, would be during the day instead of mums and families. Whereas if we were in that kind of arrangement, there's loads of like-minded people and families there, and you've got everything at the touch of a button that you need as a family. So I find that one particularly interesting at the moment.
Oh, I didn't know they opened. They opened already in New York?
Yes, so they've got one building open now, and others that are either under construction or under development. And they're, as with all other similar businesses, massively oversubscribed. But you can see why.
That's awesome. So, oh my gosh, I didn't know we go over an hour, you guys. I didn't know I'd have so much fun talking to lawyers. So I've got 2 more quick questions and we'll wrap up. This will be like a rapid fire. The next one is, what is the future? If we fast forward 10 years, we go to the year 2030, where do you see co-living? So we'll start with you, Jonathan.
It's my answer is, where do I think we'll see it and where do I hope we'll see it? So I hope and think it's going to be a pretty mainstream housing option for people. The sort of stigma around renting is breaking down rapidly in much of Europe, whereas obviously in the US it's been renting has been an economy and a culture for a long time. Whereas in London, for example, a lot of people still felt they were letting their parents down if they didn't own a house by 25. And obviously that's changing. The cost of living's gone up so much and wages haven't married with that. And so my hope is that it's a mainstream, accepted, successful housing choice, obviously with the added benefit that it's kind of that experience driven living that everyone wants as well. And I'm hoping that that drives it becoming a mainstream choice.
Awesome. Tim?
Yeah, it's an exciting one. I mean, I've gone from the living with many roommates off the Craigslist as my own personal living situation.
We've all been there.
Yeah, which works when you find the right roommates and the right situation. But it's, seeing what we're able to do now in the co-living industry, the challenges it solves for growing city, increased urbanization, something like what 2/3 of the population will be living in large cities going forward. The lower percentages of ownership and the experience space as a service generally. I think all the demographics and the trends we're seeing are moving in this direction. And we're also seeing the broadening out of that. So Jonathan's example of something for young families that are looking for this type of an arrangement that works in all the ways that co-living works, but for a broader demographic than you might have thought of. So I think we'll have a lot of segmentation in terms of the types of communities. We'll have some consolidation in terms of some big players, maybe akin to large hotel brands, some large real estate operators. I think we'll see the tech layer to it grow as well. So there will be a whole tech and services stack that develops around this, people that are providing services around these communities, and then the tech layers that make it all work, which you know quite a bit about. But then also some of those companies, as we're seeing the fast movers coming in, the innovators at this point, we'll have some large players that are coming in as well, which might include some of those in the tech industry that we know from that side. But yeah, I think it will be mainstream. It will be an asset class. It'll just be, at some point it will become, oh, of course, why didn't we think about that? This makes so much more sense than the way we used to do things, and space utilization and sustainability and all the trends that we're seeing all kind of point to that direction. It just takes time for this to happen. As we were saying, real estate doesn't move as quickly as some industries. It might be a bit behind, but I think we're kind of at the forefront of where this is going. And in terms of a growing pie of this market, it's going to be much, much larger, and it's going to be very global. So where we sit, we love it because everything we do is global, and we're seeing examples around the world, US brands going international, those from around the world going all over the region, and then just a lot of innovation and the way people are finding new approaches to solve whatever the local issues are, but then being able to take that more globally will just continue to grow.
Good stuff. And then, so what would be, Jonathan, starting with you, what is one piece of advice for any listener who's a current operator or thinking about getting into co-living as an operator? What's one piece of advice?
Know your market. So know your market is an absolute must. Every market is similar, but as I said at the start, it's so different when you get into a granular level. It's not just about real estate diligence, it's the zoning diligence, it's all of the diligence around your tech product. There are so many layers to know in that market. It's right to not only really dive in and understand that before you get too far ahead with your co-living product. It's although it's difficult to find the real estate, people get very excited when they've found the building. And so they found the building, and then they try and backfill everything in and make everything fit around finding that great piece of real estate. Whereas we try and advise people to take sort of really take a run at the market first and make sure the market works for your product, your brand, and for co-living generally. And it's right to, shameless plug, get the right advice on board. And make sure that the people you're talking to not only have experience in co-living, but also in helping you to expand that business, whether that's just in the territory you're in or whether that's overseas as well.
Cool. Tim, what's one piece of advice?
Of course, common theme for the lawyers in the room, but it's planning ahead. And I think Jonathan mentioned that, getting it right around the real estate once you found it, but there's so many things you can be doing leading up to that, and that's market diligence and all those aspects. So when the right real estate comes along, then you have all the things you need to have ready to go from an operational standpoint to be able to go and deploy, to be successful, to be on budget, to ensure that the model is going to work, that you are able to attract the users and customers into that product. And then from a legal standpoint, compliance isn't very exciting, but you need to think about it in the early days. We were talking about from a tech perspective, thinking about privacy, user information, and data as you're developing your product. You can be doing the same thing as you're thinking about scaling your team. What's the talent you need? Where does it need to be? Do you need things like visas, which can take significant amount of time? Do you have the right skill sets to be able to go and operate in that market? And then do you have the kind of wherewithal to go and execute on this? So you put in the diligence to make sure that it's the right market, you find the right real estate, do the preparation operationally so you can go in and dive in and then be effective in doing that. And that you don't get tripped up in something that could really hinder the business and being successful in that market.
Perfect. Oh my gosh. Tim and Jonathan, thank you so much. To our listeners and our viewers, look, you got an hour and a half of free legal advice. There will not be an invoice. Thank you so much, you guys. And obviously we'll have your contact information in the show notes, but so helpful, such a great conversation. And yeah, just again, excited to see this movement go, continue going global. So thanks again for coming on the show this week.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Christine.
Okay, bye. Quick reminder for those that haven't gotten their tickets yet to the annual Co-Living Hub conference. It is in Los Angeles this year. I will be there. Super excited to finally meet some of you in person. April 25th and 26th. It is for co-living operators from around the world. It's our second annual conference. Would love to have you there. It is an incredible event. So get your tickets as soon as possible. They will definitely sell out. And of course, if you're looking for the perfect software to power your co-living concept, check out Kndrd.io, Kndrd.io. Thanks.